Hello and welcome to the second week of MG305 Innovation and Technology Management. This is the second part of the introduction. Last time we had a look at different innovation processes in society. We had sustaining, incremental, radical, disruptive innovation, which are the terms we use in the course for the most part. There's also other terms. One, for example, that we're going to be having a look at today. But what we're mostly looking at today is platforms. I believe that's the main gist of week 2 in terms of at least the required readings, is you're supposed to be thinking about platforms. Now, right off the bat, because this is something I didn't know when I was starting the course, and it took me a while. I'll get to this in a second, but my question to you as the audience would be, for example, Lauritz, what do you understand as a platform? What is a platform, basically?
I do have to admit that I'm a bit unclear on the concept. I mean, I remember in class with Dimitri, we were comparing it to networks as well. So I believe like a platform is usually a connection of, I mean, I think the differentiation between network and platform is really hard, but I imagine it kind of like a network of companies, right? Interconnecting, and working together and complementing each other.
Very good. Could you give an example of a platform, given that definition?
So maybe you could say Google working with advertising agencies, right? Because it's providing a sort of marketplace where it's interacting with these players and both are providing value to each other.
Yes, that's excellent. I think especially the word marketplace is pertinent, right? Like platforms are often marketplaces, although I'm still a bit fuzzy on whether or not marketplaces are necessarily platforms or vice versa, but they're very often related to one another. Jenny, do you have a definition of platforms you would like to share with us? Okay, fair enough. So the way I've understand platforms is they're places, right? Think of a platform as a place where different user bases are being connected to one another, or even same user bases, but like it's a meeting point, and meeting points are often also places where trade happens, right? Items are transacted, and so platforms very often also become marketplaces. Amazon is a platform, but what makes it a bit more complicated is that platforms can also be understood as like frameworks that you build other things on. Now, the definition of framework is already fuzzy, so that makes platforms even more complicated. I don't want to confuse you too much, so let's just define platforms as places where the same or different user bases meet and interact with one another. And this brings me to Eisenman 2006, Strategies for Two-Sided Markets. It's blue in the title because it's actually not a reading in MG305. It's a reading in MG213, Information Systems. But to me, when I read that reading, I had MG305 in Michaelmas term, and then I went on to have MG213 in Lent term last year. And this reading really opened up platforms to me. It made me understand the economics of platforms. And that's why I want to be discussing this reading rather than the readings about platforms in MG305, because if you do this, and I'm not saying you have to, because obviously you already have a lot of readings, but through this reading, you'll be able to understand the other readings a lot better, I feel. So yeah, we've already answered the question for the most part, what is a platform? In this particular case, Eisenman talks about two-sided markets. So platforms that combine two different user bases. And he's talking about it from the perspective of a manager of a company who's providing the platform and who is connecting those two user bases. Platforms can be single-sided. They can also be multi-sided. For example, Facebook is mostly a single user platform, right? Like we as individuals use it, but then there's also, as Lauritz pointed out, advertising companies that want to get in. There's stars and celebrities or whatever who are promoting themselves on Facebook. Right. The first thing Eisenman points out is that when you're managing a platform, you have to think very hard about pricing, right? Like access to use the platform. And more specifically, he's talking about the fact that you need to subsidize. Well, you don't need to subsidize, but it often makes sense to subsidize one of the two user groups in a two-sided platform. One example would be Amazon saying that they give this. I'm actually not sure which of the two sides Amazon is subsidizing, but they have their suppliers, right? They have the people who are selling things on Amazon, and they have the people who are buying things on Amazon. And they might say, we're making the service cheaper for the people who are buying it, so us and users, and extracting value from the other user base. So subsidizing one user base to grow the platform to attract a second different user base from whom you then make money off of, profit off of. It's the same way Google provides YouTube and makes like videos and content free for us, subsidizing us, and then extracting value from advertisers. But again, you don't always have to subsidize a user base, but it can often make sense. And this is like one of the first things we need to think about when it comes to platforms is it's not the traditional economic model of maximizing profits via supply and demand necessarily, because sometimes you want to subsidize one of the two, supply or demand, in order to maximize your own cutoff profits off the whole cake. It's like the idea of growing the cake and getting a smaller share of the cake, but the cake's bigger. So overall, your share is also bigger. All right, there's also network effects. So if you think about platforms, right, the biggest ones, then successful platforms have first and foremost one thing, they have a lot of users, and the more users a platform has, the more it draws. It's very intuitive. It's like, what's the law? There's like the value of a platform is the user base squared, essentially.
Metcalfe's law, I believe.
Yes, Metcalfe. Thank you. So the bigger a platform, the more valuable it becomes. I'll jump 2 slides here. This is, you find this graph in your managerial economics textbook, Varian, because Varian is an expert in information economics. And so you have this equilibrium in a two-sided market. Short interjection here. Another key idea in the second week of MG305 is Nelson and Winter's evolutionary economics dynamic equilibria. So you don't have a single equilibrium where the market tends to, as you would have in neoclassical economics, but with information and technology, the equilibrium is constantly shifting around. In Varian's simplified model, there's 3 separate equilibria, and depending on where you are, it just pushes the whole thing to the next equilibrium or back to the lowest. So as you can see here in the graph, there's so you have 2 different user bases, and the more, so you reach a tipping point if you can get enough users. That's like the second point, where there's a natural equilibrium. But then, and as soon as you get more than that user base, more and more users will come to your platform until you get the third equilibrium where almost everyone is using it, like 80% market penetration. But until you get there, until you reach that tipping point, you will naturally drop off again because there is no point in having a communication system that no one else is using. Right, so that's Varian and Nelson and Winter. Nelson and Winter is one of the background readings in the course. Again, I have not read it yet. It's very dense. I don't think you have to read it, but at least understanding that there is this background idea in a lot of innovation and technology management papers is once again helpful. Okay. Another thing that's required, apart from, right, so when you're making the decision to subsidize a user base, you also need to have a deep understanding of who the users who are using your platform are, right? So like managing them, pitting them against one another, and figuring out the right strategy and way for them to meet. One example of this is Airbnb, right? Like, how do they connect renters or people who want to go somewhere on holiday with the people who are supplying their own rooms, essentially? And this is a particularly interesting example because a lot of people who use Airbnb are doing both, right? They're renters, but they're also people who rent other apartments. Another very striking example of this is the case of Windows and Apple. I think in the mid or late 90s, they both released software development kits, right? So understanding in this case the platform as like their software base. So, and then people outside their company might want to code applications that we, the end users, can then use on our iPhones, smartphones. Windows phones don't really exist anymore, I believe, but bear with me for the time, at the time, people were using laptops and something like Word is internally created. I'm not sure, but say a browser that people were using. And people have to decide which of the two platforms do I want to program this for? And unfortunately for Apple, they decided to charge, I think, $1,000 per year to allow people, because they put a lot of work into their software development kits, right? And they want to get money back from that. So they said, okay, if you want to use this, this is really refined, great technology, you have to pay us 1,000. Windows, on the other hand, made their software development kits free, which I think is now common practice in a lot of, like, Google and probably also Apple make theirs available for free, I believe. Don't quote me on this. And by making it free, they're basically increasing the amount of content that is being generated for their platform. So at the end of the 90s, Windows had 6 times as many applications as Apple did. And Apple solely regretted this mistake. And I believe also made their SDKs, software development kits, free. So that's like understanding, right? When to subsidize a user base, in this case, software developers, in order to attract more end users who pay $100 each indirectly for their operating system. In the case of Apple, directly. In the case of Windows, when you buy a PC and it already comes with Windows pre-installed, then Windows gets a share of that price. Same with LSE, probably paying something for the fact that we can use the Office package for free. There's another interesting case in marquee users. Marquee users are users that make certain content, I would understand, that people want. One of the most intuitive examples of this for me is game development, right? Like, you have a gaming console like Xbox, and Microsoft getting Electronic Arts to exclusively make games for their platform means that a lot of people who play games will choose to buy an Xbox rather than a PlayStation, because that's where those games that they really like are going to be on. So marquee users are users that you want exclusivity from, and so you subsidize them extra hard because those are the people you want to be providing content on your platform. On the other hand, sometimes it can happen that a lot of users, right, a reverse network effect, make it so that fewer users want to join the platform. For example, if Amazon is overcrowded with vendors, then people will fear that they're going to drown out in product and prefer to sell their products somewhere else as a result. So it's always important to consider there's users that attract other users. So for example, if a lot of customers are on Amazon, then vendors will want to sell there. And there are users that repel other users from a platform. There might even be like some online communities can be really toxic, and having those kinds of users on your platform means that other users will be repelled. Um, another interesting case that's like from my personal interest is in music technology, where apparently marquee users are not that important. Like having an exclusive album by Taylor Swift doesn't necessarily incentivize someone to switch from Apple Music over to Spotify or back. So what I'm laying out here are general rules. There's definitely exceptions to this, and this is unfortunately something that applies to all of innovation and technology management, that we're trying to predict the future based on what has happened in the past. And unfortunately, that doesn't always work. So we have to apply these frameworks, but we also have to think critically about what is actually going on there rather than just blindly applying it. Even Christensen admitted that his theory is probably incomplete and still needs a bunch of revision to perfect it, to adapt. I would even argue economics as a whole is a continually adapting thing. As Mazzucato said 2 days ago in her lecture that she was giving at the Reich College, economics, like the where value is created in society, has changed every 100 years radically, from labor to efficiency to various other things. But I'm drifting a bit off topic here. Final point regarding Eisenman's 2006 paper: win or die, which is the ruling paradigm of platforms. Either you succeed and become a massive functional platform that attracts a lot of people, basically what we see here in the third equilibrium, or you die. And what this relies on, so this whole thing of there can only be one, are three factors. The first of which is multi-homing costs. Just to reiterate, whether or not there can only be one platform in for a given market, for a given kind of user-based interaction, depends on three factors. Multi-homing costs. So if it is expensive for you as a user to be on multiple platforms, say you know how to code in Java, and then you have to switch over to Python, and there's huge costs involved. Or less complicatedly, you have all your playlists in Spotify, and you don't want to switch over to YouTube Music because you're going to lose all of them. Then there's big multi-homing costs involved. Although in the case of music platforms, I guess the switch doesn't cost you so much. It's just you don't want to put in that much effort into understanding multiple different systems. The second of which is network effects, which we've already described. So if a lot of users are on there, then even more will be drawn to it. If, for example, a smaller community, say a discussion round or something in a book group, book reading group, you don't want to have 500 people just all in the same room, especially not during Corona times. But even now, you don't want to have that many, and they're all shouting around, I really thought this passage was nice. So sometimes, if smaller groups are nicer, then the win or die mentality of platform single dominance, monopolies, also doesn't apply. And the third is commodification. So what this means is that if people want a specific product, right? Like I want a music platform for rap music. I'd rather have one based on Genius that analyzes all of the individual lyrics of a song, but I don't care that much about whether or not all of the nice new pop songs are on there. Then there's not only going to be one service, there's going to be many that cater to niche needs in the market. But if people just want the same thing, right? Like I just want to drink tap water. I don't, care if it's Mountain Crystal Spring or something. I really just want the basic service. Then again, platform monopolies become established. So that's Eisenman 2006. I talked about the biggest ideas in the paper, but please feel free to look at it yourself if you're still confused about what a platform is. This is his example of a list of different platforms. For example, PC operating systems. On the one hand, you have consumers. On the other hand, you have application developers, as we're talking about with Apple and Microsoft. And where the asterisk is, I believe, is which one is being subsidized, in this case, application developers. Okay. Yeah. Any questions so far regarding platforms or anything else?
Maybe a quick question. What influences our choice of which site to subsidize?
Okay. First of all, you don't have to subsidize, right? So sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't. For example, we see down here with Linux application servers, there's enterprises, application developers, neither is being subsidized. This is a real world example. But in regards of who to subsidize, we're getting back to this in the next reading, but to summarize, it's the one that would otherwise not be on your platform that you want to grow to attract the other one. And it's the one that you don't want to make money off of. So think about which one of the two which one of the two user bases, or generally, if you have more than two, which one of the user bases is going to be the most profitable? And so you need to think about your business model in the first place and then decide on which one to subsidize. Is this...
Hi, Leopold. Sorry, just a quick question also on that, because
Yeah.
I had a slightly different understanding of the whole subsidizing issue, but maybe I'm mistaken. So I was just wondering on your perspective on that. So I also took MG213 last year, and my understanding was that it's not really the firm subsidizing anyone, but more one customer subsidizing the other. So for example, if you look at Google Drive, up to a certain amount of storage, it's free for us, for example. But then when it comes to professional users who store a lot of stuff on Google Drive, they have to start paying at some point. So it's like the paying customer subsidizing the non-paying customer.
That's a very good point.
But then I get also what you're saying, that the... Yeah, sorry, I'm just trying to combine my understanding with what you just said about which customer is really bringing in the profit for the firm, and it's not necessarily the one who's subsidizing the other, right?
I'm not quite sure I understood the last part. Could you repeat this sentence?
Yeah, no, sorry. I mean, in the case of Google Drive, obviously, I'm guessing that the person driving the profit is the people who are paying. But then if we look at Facebook, I mean, the biggest profit are the customers that are not paying because they are giving all this data that is valuable to advertisers. Definitely. But I guess it's not exactly comparable, since in Facebook, you don't exactly have another customer who's subsidizing the other. Anyways, sorry, I don't know what my question is.
Advertisers. No. It's an excellent point, I think, that I probably should have, maybe I wasn't thinking about it as well, right? Like the whole point being, so one user base is subsidizing the other rather than the company being the one. The way I would think of it is that the company sets the structures, right? The terms of engagement or interaction between the customers. So they can decide how one subsidizes the other. So it's like the company that decides, but you're definitely right in saying that technically it's one side paying more for the other side. But I think one important thing to consider here is that when you don't have customers yet and you have to attract them, then you're already subsidizing them, right? You're making it easier for them to join your platform. And based on the fact that those people are joining, the other ones will be joining as well. And that's why I was saying, I think that it's the company or the business that is subsidizing one of the... But you're absolutely right. It's in the end, it's one of the users who will end up paying for the other user base. Does that satisfy?
Yeah, no. What you're saying also makes sense. I guess it kind of also depends on the business model. So in some cases, it's probably more what you're saying, and in some others, yeah.
Okay, but are we saying something else? Maybe I'm still unclear.
No, I think I get what you're saying.
Cool. Okay, thank you very much for your questions. Like this is like, I am personally, I love this course, but I also understand there's so many things I am unclear about, and that's part of why I'm holding these sessions. I am very grateful for any, questions, especially pointing out where I could be wrong, because those are the things I'm trying to iron out. But yeah, I actually have some friends who are working on a platform startup right now. They're trying to fight against giants like Amazon. And I pointed out, if you're going to read one paper about platforms, then this is the one I recommend. But at least so far, this has been the one I like the most about platforms. Okay. Any more questions? Then I'll be moving on to the next reading. Evans and Schmalensee, 2016. The businesses platforms are actually disrupting. So part of the reason why I wanted to have the last one to get a proper understanding of platforms is to be able to get what this one is saying. Because when I first read it for the course, I was like, what the hell does any of this mean? I don't know what disruption is, and I don't know what platforms is, so I don't know what any of this means. And it's actually very intuitive. It's a very short paper. It just makes the point that platforms are matchmaking services, right? They connect different user bases, as we were talking about before. And from that, we can infer, remember, disruption is always a relative thing. So if an innovation is disruptive, someone is being disrupted and has to fight back against it or risk extinction. And the services platforms are disrupting are matchmaking services. For example, Amazon disrupts shopping malls. In the 80s, shopping malls were places, especially in America, as far as I understood it, where people met up. When I was in Brazil, actually, still the place people are meeting up now, partially because it's like a safe place with a lot of security, so you can't get robbed. But also, it's like if you're meeting your friends, go to the shopping mall. In our countries, or don't want to infer about where, everyone is from, where I grew up, it's not really a thing anymore. And predominantly in the West, shopping malls are a cultural phenomenon of the past, an artifact. If I am using that word correctly, I'm not perfectly sure. And so what shopping malls provided before, they were connecting individual small retailers with people who wanted to buy products. Now Amazon has become the disruptor. And I was reading this book on music management and technology. And one very interesting point that was being raised is that honestly, for most things, looking something up on the internet and finding a song there is better than using a platform like Spotify. I experienced this myself actually a lot. Like I want to listen to a song and I notice, oh, God damn it, Spotify doesn't have it. Look on the internet and it's there. So my question is, if television is being disrupted, then who is disrupting it? What do you think?
Streaming services.
Okay. So can you name one?
Netflix, Amazon Prime Video.
Mm-hmm.
There are a couple of others in the US, I think.
Right. Are streaming services platforms?
Good question. To be honest, I joined the call a bit late, so I'm not sure whether you talked about the definition of platforms.
Oh, a little bit, yeah, but don't worry about it. Just like, right.
I mean, I'd say yes. Intuitively, I'd say it's a platform.
I think so too. What are the user bases on a streaming platform?
Usually, I'm not sure if that's what you mean, but like users who are paying, so subscribers.
Mm-hmm. definitely. So that's subscribers. So people like us who want to watch something. I actually refuse to get Netflix because I am not a fan of the content. But yes, generally people like us who want to watch shows, right? That's one of the user bases. But there's also a second user base on Netflix. Mostly, like Netflix makes a lot of their own shows, but there's also other cable companies, right? I mean, technically, it's the companies that own the rights to the TV shows. But for example, is it Warner or MBN that owns The Office? If they lease out that show to Netflix, if they give them the right to stream it for a while, then that's another user base that's being connected via Netflix to us, right? They're providing the service. And so Netflix is like this thing that's in between us and the production studios that make shows. They're also their own production studios. So they're competing with one of the user bases, which is quite interesting in a similar way that Amazon is competing with other people who provide products on their platform. So I think that's a great answer, streaming services. But I think I have this suspicion that streaming services are just like a transitory thing. They're just something we're using right now, but the end stage, or not necessarily the end stage, but what's coming after, is that television is being disrupted by YouTube. Because if you think about the definition of disruption, it's a product that's I wouldn't focus on the inferiority of the product, but it's like it's actually worse. Like a YouTube video is probably not as good as a television show. It's also a lot less capital intensive. It's just one guy. I could make a YouTube video. I could just sit here and make a video, upload it. Like very easy, very cheap. Obviously, there's expensive YouTube videos as well, especially music videos for songs. But in general, making one is very cheap. And a lot of the younger generation nowadays spends a lot more time on YouTube than on television. And so in this case, this is disruptive because the whole business model of television companies is based on connecting people who want to watch shows with production studios who make shows. But YouTube doesn't connect to those production studios anymore. Instead, it connects to the user base itself. So it's generating user-based content rather than, capital-intensive show production, for the most part, at least. So there's a really interesting, very short HBR article by Vessel in 2012 on the inevitable disruption of television by YouTube. And remember, disruption takes about 10, 15, 20 years. And it's a procedural thing. It's not definite. Again, there's a lot of unclarities, but at least to me, this is like something that sprung up as an idea. And when I found this, like actually all of this makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So when you're thinking about disruption.
Quickly a point about that. Don't you think though that like in terms of like obviously the advantage of like a production firm is that they have like a lot of capital, right, to make like very high quality content basically, and especially now Netflix and stuff are all moving towards their own shows, right, and like their own original production. And I think one of the reasons for that is that they're collecting more and more data, right? And I don't know if you've heard recently of this show that was created based on a collection of data where they said, I think it was the soundtrack or something, where they said they basically optimized the soundtrack based on what people liked in previous shows and use that data, right, to basically create this ultimate show. And I think that's more where it's heading. And I think especially if you have this advantage of collecting data and using it, then like platforms like Netflix make like a lot of sense, right? Because you are able to collect much better data than when you're just connecting users and basically providing this platform like YouTube. So I think like there's definitely a future for Netflix, and I can't really see how like user generated content could actually produce like disrupt like actual production.
That is an excellent point. Yeah. So big data, and based on the information we gather about users, tailoring our content is absolutely something that's coming up. But the reason why I think YouTube is disruptive in the sense is that it's not necessarily that YouTube shows are going to be as good as home production office studio shows, right? I would never say this, but I'm not so sure the average user cares that much. We want to watch, like, it's the same with, like, sure, an opera play is better than watching something on TV, but people still sit at home and watch a TV show way more often than they go to the opera, right? And I don't think Netflix is lost, by no means. But I still think that incrementally YouTube has become like this absolutely popular video streaming tool, and not necessarily just YouTube, but places like it that offer an alternative to the traditional model of connecting users to production offices. But no.
Yeah, so I was just some thoughts. So I kind of understand what you were trying to say and also see, I guess, a bit the fault in my own logic. So the way I understood what Leopold said is that if we think about the actual definition of disruption that we heard in week 1, something that is disrupting another business shouldn't just be another platform that offers series, which is Netflix, but something that completely, I guess, changes, I don't know, that brings a much more monumental change than just a new platform to consume series and productions. So I guess I understand where you're going with YouTube, but then I would say, isn't anything a disruptor that is capturing the attention away from people who used to watch TV? So now, like, you have children, I don't know, doing TikTok videos or scrolling through social media. So aren't all of those media also disruptors in the way that YouTube is, because they are completely introducing something new, unlike Netflix, which is still, it's still providing series and movies kind of like TV does. Yeah, so I guess, how do we define which of all of the new things that are coming up is the real disruptor of TV in that sense?
Absolutely. Again, disruption is such a muddly, thing that it's absolutely worth discussing over and over and over. We were watching my video last week and I was like, this is okay, but I could have really done a better job explaining disruption, honestly. After I mentioned to Will in his lecture, like, this is not disruptive, that I should have done a better job myself. But also a really good point about what is disruptive and what isn't. I think Netflix is disruptive, honestly. One of my friends wrote her essay for MG305 on Netflix and their personal strategy, and they did make inferior shows. They had an inferior product initially. Again, I'm focusing too much on this, but I think they were disruptive. I think YouTube is also disruptive. Whether or not TikTok is disruptive relative to television might be a bit of a far stretch. Like, it's still important to be conservative, but if you read the theory, if you look at the checkboxes of what disruption is, and then make a strong case for why TikTok is disruptive, then I think it could also be fair. But I would need to spend at least 5 minutes thinking about it to properly assess whether it is or not. Okay. I'm sorry I'm not offering the most clear answer on this, but I'm still really happy to be discussing disruption with you, because it shows, even for me who has spent so much time thinking about disruption, it's still something that's not intuitive. And so for a lot of companies who have never even heard of this term, or who have only heard of it, in the TechCrunch superficial kind of way, right? Read about this is disruptive, this is disruptive. This will be a really important point that you can raise as someone coming in from the outside, observing things happening in the market. And that brings me to the final point of Evans and Schmalensee 2016, which is related to Lauritz's question, which one do you subsidize? Evans and Schmalensee wrote this article. They also wrote a book. I haven't read the book, but I've read a blurb about the book. And one of the advices they give is to subsidize first mover user bases. So when you have user bases that are trading in the market, subsidize the one that makes the first move in that transaction. That's the advice they give. at the very least. Right, they also have a list of different businesses being disrupted. If you want to have a closer look at these, please feel free to screenshot. You'll also find it in the reading itself. Okay. And that brings me to Hughes' 1987, The Evolution of Large Technological Systems. To be absolutely honest with you, and this is why I have it as my second point, momentum question mark, I think it's about innovation momentum. And from my notes, I remember that it's about if there's a lot of momentum going on, so a lot of talk happening about a certain innovation and a lot of research going into that direction, then this innovation is going to survive longer than its natural expiration date. But quite honestly, if you ask me about how this paper relates to momentum, I probably give you a quite superficial answer, and I don't want to tell you anything that I'm not perfectly clear about, because that's just going to confuse you. So please have a look yourself to figure out how this relates to momentum. The things I got out of this reading, however, is that, first of all, system size relates to adaptability, which means that the bigger a technological system, right, say a platform, the less adaptable it becomes. And this also relates to Thies, Pisano, and Schuon, which is, I believe, a week 4 paper, Dynamic Capabilities and Strategic Management, because they talk about a company knowing not only what it currently can do, but what it potentially can do in the future. And so how to, like, in what ways the company is adaptive at the present stage and how it can adapt for future. My friend used this in her Netflix paper, where she made the case that Netflix was able to adapt from this mail ordering system to virtually streaming content, right? So they knew they had the internal capabilities. They set up a separate business venture to explore this, this opportunity, and eventually decided to scrap the old business and just continue in this direction. Another case the author raises is that radical innovation is initiated by outsiders. This echoes what I said last week, right? So businesses that are already established, and this relates to some degree even to platforms, are only going to change small things. They're not going to take many risks. People who are outside, who have nothing to lose in terms of established systems, are ready to take on new inventions and experiments with what is out there currently. And the final thing they say, or Hughes says, is reverse salience. Think of these. So this is a term, I think Jonathan uses it from time to time as well, and I didn't know what it meant. Think of these as innovation bottlenecks. So when you have the whole thing, you have your internal capabilities, you have your R&D department, you have your sales force, blah, 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 blah. This is the thing that's holding your innovation back from being disseminated in the market, right? This is like, so a salient is something that's, when everything else is flat, it's standing out from the curve. A reverse salient is when everything else is up here, is what's down below. It's not where it has to be for the whole system to function. And one very interesting case of this is where we had the way we organized companies back in before the 1920s was a reverse salient at the time they were trying to build a railroad system across the United States. And that was the birth of the modern company as we have it today, with shareholders and managers. It's like we needed a way to collectivize risk and to make it so that not only one person or a group of people, a small one, was responsible for this huge organizational risk of building a large infrastructure. And so instead, the companies were established and people could invest small amounts of their money, redistribute the finance of a system in order to fund these big, risky ventures. I also raised in my own essay, I was concentrating on innovation bottlenecks, and I actually argued that our management theory that we're using, so the way we think about technology, it's what's holding back biotech innovations, because a lot of the ways we think about innovation is founded in this Silicon Valley mindset based on microprocessors and transistors. But this doesn't necessarily apply to human biology in the same way. There's plenty of differences. And because of that, it's actually the way we think and our theory that's holding us back in this particular aspect. Okay, there is a graph here. I don't actually understand. Oh, goodbye, Alki. Thank you for your very incisive questions. There is a graph here. I don't understand what this graph actually means, but please feel free to have a look. And when you're reading the Hughes paper, or the chapter rather, please also consider this graph in order to better understand complex systems. Okay, I believe that draws my lecture to an end. Do you have any more questions that you would like to have answered in terms of MG305?
I have to run off as well, Leopold. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you for your questions as well. Okay, if that is everything, then for next week, again, week 4 is my favorite week. Week 3 is the week where I don't really know what I will be talking about. So what I think I will do instead is I'll have an open round where people can ask questions about how to structure their essay. And perhaps I'll present my own essay as a way to understand how you can approach answering an essay question. And my initial question that I wanted to answer and how it then changed, and I had to pivot a bit in how I was writing my essay. Cool. Then thank you very much for tuning in today, and I'll see you next time.